Iran just planted stealth submarines on the floor of the Strait of Hormuz, and America responded by sending the largest naval blockade the region has ever seen. While Iran was shaking hands at the peace table, its navy was quietly turning one of the world's most critical waterways into a potential underwater graveyard. And the terrifying part is about 20% of the world's entire oil supply flows through that same corridor. Every single day. Your energy bill, your grocery prices, the stability of global markets, all of it balances on a 33-kilometer stretch of water. And right now, that water is anything but peaceful. Let's provide more context real quick, because the setup here is genuinely fascinating. From reports, the U.S. recently offered Iran a new 30-day negotiation framework, which Iran was reviewing amidst continued fighting and mutual mistrust over naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. And while this was ongoing, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is apparently doing something else entirely underwater. Specifically, they were quietly deploying what are called Ghadir-class submarines to the narrowest, most strategically sensitive sections of the strait. And when we say quietly, we mean it literally. These things are designed to be nearly impossible to detect. Now, what exactly is a Ghadir-class submarine? Picture this: a 29-meter-long steel tube weighing 125 tons, crewed by exactly 7 people. No windows, no sunlight, no comfort. Just 7 people squeezed into what is essentially a very expensive, very dangerous metal coffin, and their job is to sit on the ocean floor and wait, for days if necessary. Nobody signs up for that, thinking it's a glamorous career, but here we are. These vessels were developed based on North Korea's Yugo-class designs, which tells you something about the budget and the ambition at the same time. But here's why they're so dangerous, despite being relatively small. Their diesel-electric engines produce an acoustic signature that blends almost perfectly with the noise of large commercial vessels passing overhead. To sophisticated sonar systems, they can look like a rock, or a school of fish, or nothing at all. And the Strait of Hormuz, it turns out, is almost perfectly designed to hide them. The average depth is about 36 meters. That's shallow enough to make it a nightmare for large nuclear submarines to operate in, but ideal for a compact vessel that can simply park itself on the seabed and go quiet. Add in irregular thermal layers in the water, strong bottom currents, and fluctuating salinity levels, all of which scatter and absorb sonar waves, and you've essentially got nature doing half of Iran's camouflage work for free. Now let's talk about what these submarines actually carry, because that's the part that grabs attention. They're armed with Volfir heavy torpedoes and JAS-2 submarine-launched cruise missiles, weapons capable of seriously threatening billion-dollar destroyers, sitting silently beneath the world's most important oil corridor. And the IRGC knows exactly what they're sitting on top of. Roughly 20 to 21% of all globally traded oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. If that corridor gets disrupted, even briefly, energy markets don't just wobble, they convulse. Insurance giants pull maritime coverage, tankers stop moving. And somewhere down the chain, the economic pressure lands on ordinary people who have absolutely nothing to do with any of this. Which is why Washington's response, when it came, was not subtle. The U.S. Navy assembled what can only be described as an overwhelming show of force. Led by the USS George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier, more than 20 heavily armed warships moved into the strait and surrounding waters. Fighter jets filled the airspace. Maritime patrol aircraft began systematic sweeps. Special operations units were placed on full combat alert. Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, the USS John Finn and USS Milius among them, positioned themselves directly behind the carrier. The USNS Carl Brashear, a logistics vessel, trailed the formation to ensure the fleet could sustain operations indefinitely without needing to pull back. The Pentagon was essentially saying, "We're not in a hurry to leave." The blockade line itself was stretched between Ras Al Had in Oman and the Iranian coastline near Chabahar, drawn so tightly that not a single vessel could pass without permission. But did that hold up? San Antonio-class amphibious assault ships, capable of supporting F-35 operations, patrolled the outer edges of the formation. Independence-class littoral combat ships, smaller, faster, specifically designed for shallow water environments, were positioned in the zones closest to the Iranian shoreline. Their role was essentially to absorb the first hit if Iran's short-range missiles or drone swarms made a move. Which, when you think about it, is a job description that really makes you appreciate your own office chair. Meanwhile, above all of this, FA-18 Super Hornets launched from the George H.W. Bush were running continuous patrols. And they weren't just circling. U.S. air assets began actively targeting Iranian-flagged oil tankers, not to sink them, but to disable them. The approach was methodical. Aircraft would first issue warnings over international radio frequencies, giving crews a final opportunity to alter course. If those warnings were ignored, the strikes were precise, targeted, and deliberately contained. MT Hosna was the first major target. On May 6, 2026, precision-guided munitions fired from FA-18s struck the vessel's smokestack directly, destroying its engine systems and turning it into what was essentially a very large, very expensive piece of floating scrap metal. Not sunk, just stopped. MTC Star 3 followed a few days after on May 8, 2026, struck by precision munitions fired from FA-18s to disable its engine systems. And then Mount Sevda followed shortly after the Star 3 on the same day, targeted by FA-18s from the USS George H.W. Bush. With its steering destroyed, that tanker drifted at the mercy of currents, completely unable to reach Iranian ports. 3 ships, no crews killed, no ecological catastrophe, and no oil spills that would have created an international backlash. Just clean, controlled denial of access. The U.S. was essentially saying, we can stop your oil exports without even getting the floor wet. By the time the operational picture became clear, 61 commercial vessels had been forced to reroute. The strait has, for all practical purposes, become an American-controlled corridor. But here's where the story gets more complicated. Iran still has cards to play, so those Ghadir submarines on the ocean floor are still there, listening, unable to intervene in what's been happening on the surface above them, watching their own Navy's tankers get neutralized one by one without being able to do anything about it. That image, the supposedly fearsome asymmetric deterrent, sitting helpless in the dark, is worth sitting with for a moment. It doesn't mean they're not dangerous, though. It means the moment hasn't arrived yet. Because the U.S. military was already preparing for the next phase. Then the P-8 Poseidon aircraft, some of the most advanced maritime patrol planes in the world, began dropping sonobuoys across the strait in systematic patterns. These are essentially floating underwater microphones, creating a detection grid across the seabed. MH-60 Seahawk helicopters were deployed with dipping sonar systems, essentially scanning the water column meter by meter. Arleigh Burke destroyers trailed their towed array sonar systems behind them, capable of picking up mechanical sounds from kilometers away. And beneath all of this, Virginia-class nuclear attack, submarines America's best, were doing what they do best, listening in the dark, waiting for a Ghadir to make a move. The moment one of those submarines moves, starts its engine. Does anything detectable? Mark 48 heavyweight torpedoes or Mark 54 lightweights are already on it. But the underwater threat isn't the only dimension to watch. Iran's asymmetric strategy has multiple layers, and Washington knows all of them. Along the coastline, hundreds of fast attack boats belonging to the Revolutionary Guard are hidden in caves, fishing shelters, and concealed inlets. These vessels are built with fiberglass hulls to minimize radar returns. They carry heavy machine guns, shoulder-fired rockets, and light anti-ship missiles. And the IRGC's plan is to deploy them in swarms, not to destroy American carriers, but to overwhelm Aegis air defense systems with simultaneous threats from every direction and hope that one missile gets through. But does this work against the U.S. Navy's current defensive architecture? Well, it's close to impossible. The phalanx CIWS systems on American destroyers can fire thousands of rounds per second. EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft can jam Iranian coastal radar and scramble their communications. The layered defense is genuinely deep. And yet the strategy isn't really about winning the naval engagement. It never was. Iran's doctrine isn't built on defeating the United States in a conventional sea battle. It's built on attrition, psychological pressure, making every single operation costly enough, complex enough, and risky enough that eventually the political will to stay erodes. It's a strategy that has worked to varying degrees for decades. Add Shade-type kamikaze drones, which are programmed to dive into radar arrays and bridge superstructures, and thousands of naval mines sitting in Iranian arsenals that could, theoretically, turn the strait's narrow passages into an impassable minefield overnight, and the threat landscape becomes genuinely layered. One mine hitting one tanker doesn't just damage a ship. It triggers Lloyd's of London and other major maritime insurers to suspend coverage for the entire region. And without insurance, tankers simply don't sail. The strait shuts down not because it's physically blocked, but because the financial risk makes transit economically suicidal. That's not a military victory for Iran. That's something more insidious, using global economic interdependence as a weapon. Here's where the financial picture becomes stark. The U.S. blockade is costing Iran an estimated $500 million per day in lost oil revenue. That number compounds every day the pressure holds. It's an economic hemorrhage that creates political fractures inside the regime itself. The hardline